There is a specific type of panic that only arrives when the noise finally stops. It happens on a Tuesday evening when the inbox is empty, or on a Sunday morning when the calendar suddenly goes blank. We are conditioned to believe this is the prize, the finish line, but instead of feeling relief, you feel a profound, suffocating unease. You find yourself instinctively searching for a problem to solve, a fire to put out, or an entirely unnecessary obligation to take on, just to escape the haunting quiet of having nothing left to do. We tell ourselves that the ultimate goal of human ambition is a state of uninterrupted rest. But what if that rest is a biological illusion? What if the acute discomfort you feel when you finally stop moving is not a flaw in your character, but the sudden exposure of a hidden survival mechanism? A glitch in the architecture of the mind that reveals our relentless drive to be busy is actually a highly sophisticated camouflage. If the absence of friction feels like a mortal threat, then what exactly are we using all that friction to hide from? You likely diagnose yourself as a workaholic. You might even use the modern vocabulary of toxic productivity to explain your inability to sit still. But this diagnosis is a trap because it assumes you are addicted to the outcome, the promotion, the achievement, the accolade. You are not. If you were truly chasing the reward, you would take the shortest, most efficient path to get it. But you do not. Look closely at your behavior when you are completely exhausted. You do not seek rest. You invent new, entirely arbitrary rules. You decide to wake up even earlier. You restrict your diet further. You add a new, meaningless metric to track. You are not chasing a prize. You are chasing the constraint. When you strip away a goal-oriented task, your brain undergoes a radical and deeply unsettling shift. A sprawling neural network called the default mode network suddenly takes over. This is the biological center of the self. It is the machinery the brain uses to process your identity, your past, and your unfiltered emotional state. For anyone who has spent years constructing a highly regulated life, stepping into the default mode network does not feel like a peaceful return to the self. It feels like falling into an abyss. Think about the last time you were forced to lie in the dark with no screens, no obligations, and no distractions. The silence quickly becomes aggressive. Unprocessed anxieties rise to the surface. The shapeless, heavy burden of simply existing without a script becomes intolerable. And so, you reach for discipline, not to conquer the world, but to conquer your own awareness. The rigid schedule, the impossible standard, the grueling routine, these do not actually make you a better person. They serve a much more primitive function. They anesthetize the default mode network. By flooding your working memory with rules, boundaries, and friction, you successfully drown out the noise of your own consciousness. But a profound question remains. How does a psychological anesthetic mutate into a biological dependency? What happens inside the skull when the cage you built to protect yourself suddenly becomes the only place you feel alive? The common misunderstanding is to look at this through the lens of pleasure. We assume the brain gets hooked on the reward of a job well done, but neuroscience reveals a much stranger reality. Dopamine is not a molecule of pleasure. It is the biological currency of prediction. It is released when you successfully close the gap between what you expect to happen and what actually happens. When you enforce a relentless routine, you construct an environment of absolute predictability. Your executive function is constantly engaged in navigating this tight, self-imposed labyrinth. The brain floods your system with dopamine not because you are achieving something magnificent, but because you are successfully executing a highly specific prediction. You become chemically dependent on the micro-anticipation of following your own rules. Simultaneously, this rigid control generates a continuous, low-grade stress response. Your cortisol levels remain elevated just enough to keep your nervous system vigilant. Over months and years, neuroplasticity fundamentally alters your homeostatic set point. The brain physically rewires its calibration of safety. It decides that the state of being tightly wound, constrained, and under pressure is the normal baseline of existence. To make this permanent, the brain delegates this new operating system to the basal ganglia, the deep structures responsible for habit formation and implicit memory. The agonizing decision-making of the prefrontal cortex is bypassed. The memory of the existential dread you felt in the quiet is encoded as a direct threat, while the friction of the routine is encoded as the antidote. You are no longer choosing to wake up at dawn or push yourself to the brink. Your neurochemistry is demanding it. If you attempt to rest, your dopamine drops and your cortisol spikes, not because you are lazy, but because you have disrupted the exact chemical architecture your brain rebuilt itself to rely on. You have successfully engineered your own dependency. But this revelation leads us to a deeply unsettling philosophical question. If the brain can rewire itself to find freedom terrifying and bondage comforting, what does that say about the true nature of human will? The 19th century philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer observed that human existence swings like a pendulum between two extremes. On one side is the agonizing pain of unfulfilled desire, and on the other is the crushing, gray emptiness of boredom. Most of us spend our lives fleeing from one toward the other, but the modern addict of discipline has found a way to hack this pendulum. By making the routine infinitely rigid and the standards impossibly high, they ensure they never reach the end of their striving. They use the pain of relentless friction to permanently barricade the door against the void of meaninglessness. But why is that void so terrifying? Friedrich Nietzsche understood that the absolute heaviest burden a human being can carry is not physical labor, but the responsibility of creating their own meaning. True freedom is not a comfort. It is an abyss. It demands that you look into the emptiness and author your own values without any external script to guide you. Fleeing into the narrow, suffocating corridors of a grueling discipline is very often not an act of supremacy. It is an act of philosophical cowardice. It is infinitely easier to submit to the tyranny of a spreadsheet or a morning regimen than to stand alone in the paralyzing ambiguity of an unscripted life. This is where our modern interpretation of ancient wisdom becomes profoundly distorted. We routinely weaponize the philosophy of Stoicism to legitimize this addiction. We convince ourselves that by stripping away comfort and enforcing merciless routine, we are following the example of the ancients. But the actual logic of thinkers like Epictetus dismantles this entirely. The Stoic ideal was to build an internal fortress so impenetrable that your peace of mind remained completely untouched by the chaos of the external world. If your psychological stability completely shatters the moment your schedule is disrupted, you have not mastered yourself. You have simply traded the unpredictable tyranny of the world for the predictable tyranny of your own alarm clock. This illusion, the tragic mistaking of self-imposed bondage for self-mastery, is not a modern invention. It is a psychological trap that has silently consumed some of the most formidable minds in human history. What happens when a genius uses their brilliance to construct the perfect cage? If you walk through the archives of human history, you begin to see it not as a parade of triumphs, but as a museum of elaborate coping mechanisms. Consider Isaac Newton. We memorialize the falling apple and the elegant laws of motion. We rarely focus on the man who spent years in darkened rooms, enduring severe sleep deprivation and engaging in obsessive, solitary alchemical rituals. Newton did not work with such terrifying intensity because he was simply driven by scientific curiosity. He worked with that level of fury because when the work stopped, his mind fractured. His rigid, isolated discipline was a barricade against profound psychological collapse. The mathematics were not his destination. They were his anesthetic. Look at Ludwig van Beethoven. As his hearing decayed, the external world grew relentlessly silent. To survive this suffocating quiet, he constructed a life of militant, almost violent routine. He would pace his room furiously, obsessively counting his steps. He demanded exactly 60 coffee beans for his morning brew, pouring them out and counting them one by one. He composed not merely to leave a legacy, but to generate an overwhelming cognitive friction that would drown out the existential dread of his isolation. We idolize these figures and mistakenly attribute their legendary output to their legendary discipline. We reverse the causality. Their extreme routines were not the engine of their greatness. Their brilliance was simply the raw material they used to build a more sophisticated cage. They did not conquer their inner void through willpower. They merely managed to outrun it by turning their own existence into a labyrinth with no exit. If the greatest minds in history fell victim to this illusion, using their genius only to construct stronger traps, how does an ordinary person recognize when their own pursuit of structure has crossed the line from architecture into imprisonment? And more importantly, how do you dismantle a cage when the very act of trying to escape requires the exact discipline you are trying to escape from? You cannot use a regimen to cure an addiction to regimens. Attempting to schedule your rest or gamify your relaxation is simply building a new wing onto the same cage. The cognitive shift required here is not to find a more efficient way to unwind, but to entirely redefine what is happening when the panic sets in. When you strip away the routine and the existential dread floods your chest, you must stop interpreting that feeling as a mechanical error. It is not a signal that you are broken or that you need to find a new problem to solve. It is simply the sensation of your unshielded consciousness breathing for the first time in years. The transformation occurs in the exact moment you choose to sit with that suffocating anxiety without reaching for a task to smother it. You have to practice deliberate, unstructured uselessness, not scheduled leisure. True decay. You must consciously train your brain to accept that you are allowed to be a noun rather than a perpetual verb. You stop trying to manage the silence, and you just let it be loud. You allow the shapeless burden of simply existing to weigh on you until your nervous system finally realizes it is not going to die. But once you step out of the labyrinth and stop running from your own existence, what is actually left underneath all that friction? What is left is not peace. It is presence, the heavy, terrifying, beautiful reality of being completely unscripted. We spend our days convinced that if we stop moving, we will disintegrate. But the opposite is true. It is only when you stop moving that you can finally see where you are standing. The quiet tragedy of turning discipline into an addiction is that you successfully engineer a life where nothing can break you. But in the process, you make yourself completely impermeable to everything else. You spend decades building an impenetrable fortress, only to realize you were protecting a ghost. The machine you constructed becomes so flawless that it eventually no longer requires a pilot. And so, the pilot simply fades away. The ultimate challenge of your life is not to build a more ruthless routine. It is to look at the intricate labyrinth you have constructed and ask yourself one inescapable question. If you finally dropped the rope and stopped pulling the weight of your own artificial existence, would there be anyone left underneath to experience the silence?